My name is Dewayne Whitehead. I've been teaching for the Explorers for the last 18 years. Topics having to do with cultural anthropology. They wanted to have me talk about water. So in anthropological terms, put together, of course, people, Homo sapiens, and water. How important it is to life, how important it is to where these civilizations arose, always on river basins. The word is everybody's running out of drinking water. Well, when you look at the way fresh water is used, and it's only about 3% of the total water available on Earth, and you consider that half of that is wasted, that conservation is the biggest source of water. And then there are other technologies such as desalination, a number of technologies, and that's getting very cheap. So that you can have desalinated water now with the new technologies for very low cost, although we will start appreciating, respecting water when water costs us some money. When it's free, people waste it. And it's not just Americans, they're doing it all over the world. That when you transport water for long distances, like electricity, up to 50% of it is wasted. Well, if we can recover the wasted water, fresh water, then we just have to worry about different problems, civilization problems of the world. There are different societal problems in getting fresh water to Africans, to some Indians, and to Chinese and so on. And those are societal problems, that the water is there, and we can get cheap water to those people, but that doesn't keep dictators and bad government from keeping people from appreciating such things as water that you can't live without. I always have a bibliography of books that, and some of my courses are primarily from the written word books. In subjects such as water, there is so much new information, new technology that is breaking into the news every year that you can't just teach from books. Because books are cover an area maybe 10 years, 20 years, 30 years in the past. All bestsellers on water, and none of them more than 2 years old. They are interesting background, and I read them all. But every feature aspect that I thought was worth including in a lecture, I went to the internet and got the best sources of information, and some of these were absolutely current, such as the MIT Symposium on Desalination Processes of April of this year. And you need to be current on something like the topic I am just now teaching.
Homo sapiens and water, part 2 of a 6-part series, Aquifers. There was a range of mountains before the Rockies. The Laramide orogeny, new Rocky Mountains among the debris of the old. The Laramide orogeny, Rocky Mountain Formation. It started 70 to 80 million years ago and ended 35 to 55 million years ago, amid seas and debris from previous mountains. The crust was compressed and elevated, breaking into low mountain peaks that continued to grow over several million years. The plains also lifted, pushing seas out.
East of the Rockies for 600 miles and south through the Texas Panhandle, about 1,000 miles, there is a giant aquifer called the High Plains Aquifer, or the Ogallala Aquifer. Only the one under the Sahara Desert is bigger. Maybe.
Settlers moving west through Nebraska in the 1890s, setting up homesteads along the Little Blue River, or the West Branch of the Big Blue River, noticed that if they dug a hole in the ground where the Oregon Trail crossed Beaver Creek in a bed of gravel, water would come pouring out of the ground. They named it Beaver Crossing. Dewayne Whitehead was born there in 1931. His family lived in several places in the valley at Beaver Crossing. At each place, someone just put 1-inch pipe in the ground, and they had a supply of sparkling fresh water that ran night and day. The water temperature was 54 degrees Fahrenheit, winter and summer. In the 30s, Dewayne was not aware for several decades farmers had been shallow plowing the prairies to plant corn and wheat in essentially drought conditions for several years. The wind blows all the time on the prairies, and in the mid-1930s, as the crops failed, the scrumpy topsoil became airborne and went south. Dewayne remembers the sun as a faint disk in the brown sky at noon in Beaver Crossing during those times. That's Nebraska topsoil in Oklahoma. As a result, Okies packed up and headed for the San Joaquin Valley in California. And just in time, here's the same Nebraska topsoil, and maybe some from Kansas, headed for Texas and the Gulf of Mexico. On a good wind, the soil went up as high as 30,000 feet. Farms in Nebraska, Kansas, Oklahoma, and the panhandle of Texas were stripped of topsoil. That's when the Okies went to California, which is the setting for John Steinbeck's 1939 novel, The Grapes of Wrath. The source of all this fresh water that saved the day for the farmers is an aquifer that underlies parts of Nebraska, South Dakota, Colorado, western Texas, and Oklahoma down through the Texas Panhandle. A total of 174,000 square miles. It was formed 1.6 million years ago by clays, sand, and gravel deposited by streams flowing eastward and south from the eroding Rocky Mountains. This is a map of some of the major aquifers in the United States. Beaver Crossing, Nebraska. Until 1960, beavers still swam in Beaver Creek, which was fed by an artesian spring from the Ogallala Aquifer. Through the 20s, 30s, 40s, and 50s, these 6-inch or 8-inch artesian wells ran full force, 24/7, 365 days a year, first into a ditch or pond, and then into the creek or the Little Blue River. In 1931, Beaver Crossing, Erie Smiley had 50 ponds used to propagate goldfish and rainbow trout for Lincoln restaurants, the trout that is, and water lilies for commercial mail order trade to 48 states. Dry land plants included a broad line of colors in peonies and bearded iris. Dewayne used to work there. The pipe sticking up in each pond was connected to the flowing well that keeps the water fresh and moving. The round sand-bottom swimming pool was more than 2 acres, 12 feet deep under diving boards, 10 feet at the turtle roost, and 3 feet at concrete edges. Boats were for hire in the 1930s. A 6-inch well kept the water fresh. The bottom probably drained into the aquifer, but also to a creek that frequently flooded the park. This could be the aquifer at Beaver Crossing on the Little Blue River.
The Platte River is formed in western Nebraska by the confluence of the North Platte and the South Platte rivers, which both arise from snowmelt in the eastern Rockies east of the Continental Divide. The Platte River then flows east to confluence with the Missouri River, 10 miles south of Omaha, on the border with Iowa.
The Platte River in Nebraska, a mile wide and an inch deep. In the dry years of the 30s, the Platte River did not flow. These trees and shrubs in this slide are reaching the aquifer. In the 1930s, after the drought, this was the flow of the Platte with increased rainfall. A place of rest for migrating birds. Sunset on the Platte. Birds settling in for the night. The Platte River in spring, in a good year. And in late summer on an average to meager year. Platte River, central Nebraska. Man-made tap of aquifer that sustains the Platte River. Man-made dams for anthropocentric purposes have devastating effects on the aquifers and natural habitat. Man-made dams come in many sizes, which are wholly focused on the needs of the human population. While having a lesser impact on the natural habitat, the smaller New England dams serve only human needs. Rivers that flow free are the result of a natural evolutionary process that support life from mountaintops to the sea. Free-flowing rivers support the natural evolution of the species above aquifers. Lake formed by the Mengquang Dam provides the human population with access to water. With the free water so readily available, people could now grow crops in the desert conditions of the prairie and also have green lawns. This is a picture of lawn irrigation in Hoxie, Kansas. Texas suburban developments with golf courses are so richly hydrated by man that it could be a golf course in Scotland. One can imagine the real estate developer saying during the design process, "There's no reason we can't have a river running through our golf course. We just make one from the free water found in the aquifer."
Life on a Colorado farm, where once prairie grass grew. Ogallala Aquifer water. No crops without it. Next week the water will be turned off and the canal will be dry till next March.
Pivot irrigation in Georgia. This picture happens to be Georgia, land of the frequently empty reservoirs, but it could be Kansas or Oklahoma. Pivot irrigation in western Nebraska.
An aerial view of western Texas. The dark green area is probably alfalfa.
The Ogallala Aquifer is an enormous underground water source for Middle America. Found under 8 states from Texas to South Dakota, it is literally life-giving to this part of the country. The areas above the aquifer were the center of the Dust Bowl in the 1930s, and the water in the Ogallala has been tapped for human and agricultural use for decades since. Environmental Defense released a report in 2009 that tries to calculate the impact of biofuel plants, corn for ethanol, might have on the aquifer. New ethanol plants in the area would use up to an extra 2.6 billion gallons of water a year and another 120 billion gallons to grow the corn. Pumping that much water could cause depression-style dust bowls. This corn would be grown in erstwhile prairies that cannot produce a crop without irrigation. Using the free water from the aquifer, the region became one of the world's breadbaskets. No more. The party is over. The Ogallala is from dangerously low to dry in the Texas Panhandle for growing short staple cotton in the desert. Cotton is, along with alfalfa and sugarcane, among the thirstiest plants in the world. It is grown in marginal to poor land because it is a high-value crop. It needs heat, but the heat is responsible for evaporating more than half the fresh water that is used to grow it. Cotton, the crop that ruined the Ogallala in Texas. The West Texas short staple cotton is now banned in West Texas. Water is so low in the aquifer, it is too expensive to pump it. The aquifer may not recover, be rechargeable, even if there was water to put back in. Cotton looked good while you could pour on fresh water. Now, much of the land will only support desert plants. If you burn off the stickers on the prickly pear, the cattle will eat the meaty, non-nutritious leaves. They thought the drip irrigation would save the crop, but it just put off the collapse for a few years. Now the land is reverting to scrub grass for grazing. If they don't overgraze it, the land may produce beef. Back where they started, but without the water. Not much use for irrigation and harvest equipment now. 174,000 square miles of once water-filled sand and gravel put down about 10 million years ago. The yellow and orange are dangerously low. The red has the indicator on empty. Note, Nebraska is in better shape because of the Platte River basin recharging the aquifer. Dismal River, Hook County, Nebraska. In western Kansas, 900 to 1,400 wells were checked for their amount of decline in 2011 and 2012. The numbers are losses in these years. Indian short staple cotton. Same story in India, China, Kyrgyzstan, and Egypt. Carrizo Springs is at the southern end of the Carrizo Aquifer, the red cross-hatched area in this slide, in Texas. Dewayne Whitehead's brother-in-law, Leon Brown, had a 5,000-acre ranch on the Rio Grande in Asherton, Texas. He bulldozed an acre or more, 25 feet deep, and hit water for his cattle. He plowed up the mesquite shrubs and planted grass seed, hoping for rain in 3 to 4 years for some grazing. Leon's ranch, almost, but not quite, bordered on land over the Carrizo Aquifer, where they plowed up the bone-dry prairie and planted miles and miles of spinach and carrots for the eastern markets. Dewayne used to watch the huge pivot sprinklers watering the produce 50 years ago. Back then, he didn't think about them pumping the groundwater dry and leaving a desert in just a few decades. Windmill pumps for stock watering were no problem for the aquifer. It was modern pumps using fossil fuels to pull up millions of acre-feet of irreplaceable fossil water that drained the supply. The following is from a March 2012 article in the National Geographic. Quote, "The new rule issued by the High Plains Underwater Water Conservation District based in Lubbock, Texas, declares that water pumped in excess of the allowable production rate is illegal. In Texas, a bastion of the free market and the Republican and Tea Party, such a rule is hard to fathom. Most of the state abides by the rule of capture, which basically allows farmers to pump as much water as they want from beneath their own land. But irrigators in the northwest Texas rely on the Ogallala Aquifer, an underground water reserve that is all too rapidly disappearing. If the region is to have any future at all, water users must find a way to curb the pumping. As the level of Lake Lavon drops, the threat of a North Texas water crisis rises. There used to be a bridge here. The system hasn't changed much. Homo sapiens just entered the equation. The most recent High Plains Ogallala Regional Resource Study was sponsored by the U.S. Department of Commerce and was released in mid-1982. It treated the climate as a given, and a favorable given at that. Nowhere in the study is climate variability or climate change mentioned. It was the time when discussion of climate change and man's impact on it was just starting. But climate change was not involved when people plowed the prairie. The 5-year drought of the early 30s was not abnormal, nor the winds that blew topsoil of 4 states into the Gulf of Mexico. It was ignorance of the land. And climate change had nothing to do with man's determination to grow water-greedy crops where nature alone would never let them prosper. Mankind proved that you could grow anything in the desert as long as you had a good supply of water. Like the Jews making the Negev desert bloom. But at what price? It took a century to prove the impact water alone had on Palestine. There's more on that in later sessions. Now, in the 21st century, more prairie is being given back to nature. The North American bison is being repatriated in central and northern plains that Michener wrote about in Centennial. It's a tough lesson.
Frank Hall found this list of laws controlling water in the U.S. And I said, well, since I have it, it's a good chance to tell you about the how conditions are different now. It puts these into a different light than when they were written. These were written over the last 100 years about management in Southwest, in California, and east of the Mississippi and so on. But the thing is, they are not relevant anymore because of the great growth in agriculture, the pumping dry of the aquifers like the Ogallala. So these are obsolete, so to speak. They're still on the books, but no one pays any attention to them. There probably are areas in the country where such a diverse geography, so there may be areas where they are still relevant. But in the important areas like the Southwest, people were talking about Arizona. We're going to address Arizona. Because that's a special case. Phoenix is a place incipient disaster, and it's going to evolve over the next 20 to 30 years. But it is in deep trouble today. And these laws were meant to control some of those things, but everybody wants a piece of the Colorado River, and the commitment that who has the right to the water in the stream on a ranch or in the city or whatever. You know, Las Vegas is already taking half the surviving water. Half the water in the reservoir goes out in evaporation. And when the river enters Mexico, it's a muddy, polluted mess. It doesn't flow. And that's what we've done to the Colorado. So these things have not kept us from doing some awful things with water. And the amount that we pump out and run on the surface over to the Imperial Valley to irrigate crops, which are very important to our economy. But we lose half of it getting it there in open canals. And that's not new. People have known that for 1,000 years. That you have 10 different government institutions allocating water from a given watershed. So you have allocated 175% of the flow of the Colorado River to various people. Yeah, and that's the trouble. No, there's no comprehensive flow. This is an attempt at management, but there is no comprehensive view of those sources to be used in a sensible way across the country.
Homo sapiens' legacy of the 20th century on the Great Plains. Irrigated wheat grew here 2 years ago. Can we get back to the windmill? We can sustain that. Next month, we'll look at the Persian legacy of our exploration of the modern world Homo sapiens' relationship with water.